want to show you guys something real quick. This is from CFR, and it's a part of Title V. Now, we know that Title V from my previous videos is a positive law, and it's part of government, organization, and employees. And I've explained to you how under Title V employees are required to pay a federal tax because they receive compensation for working with the federal government. So when we go to the CFR, we see you can look under OLRC Title V to find where the taxes are. But it has in here the employee tax requirement. Now, the reason why they have to pay a tax is because they receive money from the government, specifically to them from the federal government. Okay, so those of us who don't work for the federal government, we pay tax according to a contract, an offer and acceptance. So when we go to the Code of Federal Regulations for Title V, we see that they have their, I think it's the Internal Revenue Code. Let's see, Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation. It's only federal people that are required to have their pay directly deposited. People outside of the federal government who don't receive compensation for their work, in that they don't work directly for the federal government, are not required to have direct deposit. They're not required to pay the Internal Revenue Service. Regulations governing employees of the Office of Personnel Management, civil service rules, civil service regulations. Civil service means they are civil servants. Civil servants work for the federal government, and they are required to pay a tax on their pay because they have a lot of benefits, such as the retirement. And on the federal lands, all the federal laws apply. So when a contractor such as Lockheed Martin does business with the federal government, as part of its contract, it may be required to also follow all the federal rules. So Chapter 21, Department of the Treasury. So in general, designation of separate agency components. So you have the Alcohol and Tobacco Tax and Trade Bureau, Bureau of Engraving and Printing, Fiscal Services, Financial Crimes Enforcement, and Internal Revenue Service. This is E. That doesn't let me go to click and see what E says, but E, the Internal Revenue Service, applies to these people. Constitutionally applies to these people. Everything else is basically, as far as private people are concerned, people not part of the federal government, not civil servants, not employees of the federal government in any capacity, are not required to pay the taxes to the Internal Revenue Service as part of its constitutional agreement with the states. If you pay a tax, it's between you and your employer, and the tax Internal Revenue Service But outside the Constitution is a private contract. And we see that in the forms approval process, because the forms may look just like the same ones that government civil servants use, but they're different in whether it's a private contract or it's a contract between an employee and the federal government. So there's different ways for them to do business with people, whether it's constitutional or not. They just use contracts. Now, if the federal government, the people who wrote the Constitution, meant for the federal government to make all these contracts, then the Constitution could have been much simpler. They could have just said, hey, we have the right to make contracts, and all of our contracts are lawful and legally binding, and we can contract with whoever we want, and end of story. There's no need for 5 pages of what the federal government can do and what it can't do, because basically everything can be considered a contract. So if it wanted to just give itself the right to make contracts for military purposes or for whatever purpose, then they could have just said that. But instead they've got all this other stuff going on, and I believe it's just because they want to confuse people, and they want to act outside the Constitution, and outside the Constitution they created these instrumentalities, and these instrumentalities are what are contracting with the employers or corporations doing business with the federal government, registered to do business with the federal government, and therefore using the federal forms to contract with people to pay taxes and other things, to pay now insurance and pay basically whatever they want you to buy. They'll just contract with you to do that. And they'll just tell you have to do it. They'll just tell you have to. So here's Title 26 if you want to read that. But remember, Title 26, under the law, under the Office of the Law Revision Council website, is not a positive law. And I've talked about that, I think, enough now. So it's not a law. But if they're going to operate it, they've got to operate it according to the codes. Okay, so more information on what the government's doing to you, how they're doing it, and they're doing it with your agreement through your signature, which is a positive act on your part to pay a tax based on the money you receive from your employer because your employer chose to do business with the federal government. And there's nothing in the Constitution that requires any private corporation or business to do business with the federal government. This was all just sort of a Rockefellerian way or progressive way to use government appearance of authority to gain control over people. And what they do is they take this money and they use it to fund their pet projects, to give to the colleges and universities to teach from the books they want them to teach from, to send to the education department to teach from the books they want to teach from, and to create these pharmaceutical companies, and to create these law enforcement agencies that don't belong in a constitutional republic, don't belong in a federation, have no real authority, so on and so forth, with many of the corporations and organizations that are registered as doing business with the federal government for whatever purpose they choose to, and also for funding the policies, because policies are not in the Constitution. The Constitution is the Constitution. They're supposed to follow the Constitution. But if you're giving them money to enforce policy not in the Constitution, then that's between you and the instrumentality and the paperwork that you sign to give them money. So it's about time we all became educated on the fact that the federal government is using an instrumentality to pretend that it has a force that it doesn't have. And if you ask the instrumentality, where do you get your force from? They'll say Congress, because Congress says we have the right to, and whatever it is they choose to have the right to do, whereas Congress was never given the right to contract with private people. That's why they have to have their instrumentalities to do it. So it's a redundant circle. It's cyclical. It just goes round and round and round. Congress says we have the power to do it. Congress says we have the power to do it. Congress is using the Constitution to say they have the power to do it. They don't actually have the power to do it, which is why they use the instrumentalities, and the instrumentalities say Congress gives us the right to do it, and Congress says we have the right to do it by the Constitution, and nobody really knows the truth of anything. So Congress doesn't have the right to do it, which means they don't have the right to give their instrumentalities the right to do it, because a right delegated cannot be redelegated, and a right not delegated cannot be redelegated. And so if you understand that the Congress only has the right to make law for the federal people on the federal lands, then you also understand that it has the right, or doesn't have the right, to tell the instrumentalities that they can do things for them off federal lands. The instrumentalities, being quasi-public private corporations, are acting publicly with the federal government and then private outside the federal government. And we're private because we're not receiving money from the federal government as employees of the federal government or military people of the federal government. And so we're not receiving money to be taxed from the federal government. Okay, but we are using the dollars, which opens up another can of worms. The fiat currency created through their titles, which are tender, because they're contracts, and contracts are legal, and legal is fiction. And we know by now that the dollar that the Federal Reserve uses, that the government uses, is fiction. Okay, it's based on debt. All right, so like, share, subscribe. See you in the next video.